August 6, 1942. The aircraft carrier Shokaku drifted quietly in the still waters of Truk Lagoon, an island stronghold hidden deep in the Pacific. On the surface, the ship seemed calm, its flight deck empty, its hangars silent. But below deck, in a cramped room lit by a single overhead bulb, the mood was anything but calm. 5 senior Japanese naval officers sat around a long steel table covered in papers, maps, and reports. The air was heavy with cigarette smoke. The fans on the ceiling clicked softly, barely cutting through the heat. No one spoke. They'd been there for hours, buried in silence, reviewing numbers that none of them wanted to believe. For months, Japan's high command had insisted the empire was winning, that victory was inevitable, that their enemies were collapsing under the rising sun. But these men knew better. Every chart, every casualty list, every intelligence summary told the same story: the tide had turned. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, a man known for his sharp mind and unflinching honesty, finally leaned forward, breaking the long silence. His voice was low, steady, but filled with something the others had rarely heard from him: defeat. "Gentlemen," he said, eyes fixed on the papers before him, "we must accept what these numbers tell us. The war is lost." The words hung in the air like smoke. No one contradicted him. No one dared. They didn't need to. Every man in that room had already come to the same conclusion. They had lost the initiative. They had lost the momentum. And, most dangerously of all, they had lost time. It had been exactly 2 months since the Battle of Midway, the battle that changed everything. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, the pride of their navy, had been sunk in just a few hours. Hundreds of elite pilots gone. Thousands of sailors lost. It wasn't just a defeat, it was a wound the empire could never heal. Now, sitting in that dimly lit room in August 1942, these officers were staring at the numbers that proved what none of them wanted to say out loud: Japan's greatest victory, Pearl Harbor, had also been the beginning of its end. 8 months earlier, that same empire had shocked the world. In a single morning, Japanese aircraft had torn through the American fleet at Pearl Harbor, destroying battleships, airfields, and over 2,000 lives. Newspapers around the world called it the most daring military strike in modern history. Japan's leaders called it destiny. But Yamaguchi and the others had begun to see what their superiors refused to admit. The attack that was meant to break America had done something far more dangerous: it had united it. In that moment, as Yamaguchi's words faded into silence, every officer in the room understood the same brutal truth. The empire that had risen so fast was now trapped in a war it could no longer win. The industrial might of the United States was waking up, and it would not stop until Japan was crushed completely. Still, none of them could say it openly. To admit defeat, even in private, was treason. So they said nothing. They simply sat there, staring at the numbers, each man lost in the same silent thought. History remembers the great battles: Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, but not this meeting. This meeting was different. There were no headlines, no orders, no victory speeches. Only 5 men quietly realizing that their nation's fate was sealed. And yet, it's in that silence, in that smoke-filled room, that the real story of Japan's defeat begins. Because to understand how these admirals reached such a devastating conclusion, how triumph turned to tragedy in just 8 months, we have to go back to where it all started. December 7, 1941, ***. The day the world changed forever. December 7, 1941. A calm Sunday morning in Hawaii. The sky was clear, the water still. Sailors aboard the U.S. Pacific Fleet's battleships were just beginning to wake up, some writing letters home, others lining up for breakfast. No one knew that, at that very moment, hundreds of miles away, over 350 Japanese aircraft were already racing toward them, an armada of death flying under complete radio silence. At 7:48 a.m., the first wave struck. Within minutes, Pearl Harbor was transformed into hell on earth. Bombs ripped through the decks of American battleships. The Arizona exploded in a ball of fire so violent it lifted the entire ship from the water. Flames swallowed the Oklahoma as she rolled onto her side. Pilots screamed over the radio, chaos erupted, and black smoke covered the harbor like a funeral shroud. The attack lasted barely 2 hours, but by the time the last plane turned for home, the damage was staggering. 8 American battleships had been sunk or crippled. Nearly 200 aircraft destroyed. Over 2,400 Americans dead. To the world, it looked like a masterpiece of precision, a flawless strike that changed the balance of power overnight. To Japan, it was proof that destiny favored them. In Tokyo, bells rang, people filled the streets cheering, newspapers declared the empire invincible. The rising sun had humiliated the West. But beneath that celebration, a handful of officers already saw something deeply wrong. Because for all its brilliance, Pearl Harbor had failed in the one way that mattered most. The American aircraft carriers, Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, weren't there. They had been out at sea. The most important targets in the entire harbor had simply escaped. And that wasn't the only oversight. The attack had ignored Pearl Harbor's massive oil storage tanks, millions of gallons of fuel that powered the entire Pacific Fleet. They hadn't been touched. The repair yards that could restore damaged ships? Untouched. The submarine base, America's most lethal, long-term weapon against Japan, still fully operational. The Japanese had won a battle, but not the war-changing victory they thought they had achieved. Admiral Isoroki Yamamoto, the mastermind behind the attack, understood this better than anyone. He was a gambler, a strategist, but above all, a realist. He had warned Japan's government before the war even began, asterisk. If we go to war with America, we can run wild for 6 months, maybe a year. After that, I can promise nothing. Asterisk. He knew the truth, Japan could never outbuild America. Its factories, its resources, its manpower, all dwarfed Japan's. That's why Pearl Harbor had to be perfect. It had to destroy the U.S. Navy's ability to respond before America could even stand back up. And when Yamamoto received the first reports of victory, he didn't celebrate. Instead, he is said to have muttered a quiet warning. I fear all we have done is awaken a sleeping giant, and fill him with a terrible resolve. Asterisk. Whether he actually said those exact words doesn't matter. Because every man who had seen what America was capable of knew it was true. In the weeks that followed, Japan advanced across the Pacific like wildfire, conquering the Philippines, Malaya, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, and more. For a brief, blinding moment, it looked as if Yamamoto's bold strike had achieved the impossible. But inside the Navy's intelligence rooms, analysts were already whispering the same fear. This victory wasn't built to last. America was hurt, yes, but it was angry. And an angry industrial giant was something Japan simply couldn't afford to face. In Tokyo, the government saw victory. In Hawaii, America saw revenge. The difference between those two perspectives would decide the future of the war. And as Japan celebrated, the countdown had already begun, the 8-month window Yamamoto had warned about. 8 months before America's factories, shipyards, and airfields would awaken. 8 months before Japan's early advantage would vanish forever. By August of 1942, that window had slammed shut. And the empire that thought it could control the Pacific was about to discover what happens when this sleeping giant finally opens its eyes. In the weeks after Pearl Harbor, Japan's empire expanded at breathtaking speed. Manila fell. Singapore surrendered. The British fleet was destroyed in the South China Sea. The rising sun flag was flying over territories that had once belonged to Western powers, and for a brief, shining moment, Japan stood on top of the world. Newspapers in Tokyo printed maps showing a crimson empire stretching from Burma to the Solomon Islands. The radio called it the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, a new order that would last 1,000 years. But inside the naval command rooms, the tone was far less triumphant. Because every admiral, every strategist, every intelligence officer knew something the public didn't. They knew the empire had borrowed time, not gained it. And that time was running out. Even before the first bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Admiral Yamamoto's intelligence team had done the math. Their calculations were chillingly precise. Japan had, at most, 8 months before the industrial might of the United States began to flood the Pacific. 8 months before American factories would produce more aircraft, more ships, and more weapons than Japan could ever dream of. 8 months, that was the window. In that time, Japan had to do the impossible: conquer enough territory, build enough defenses, and secure enough resources to make America hesitate. If they could bleed the U.S. enough, maybe, just maybe, Washington would agree to a negotiated peace. That was the plan. That was the gamble. But beneath the surface, even that plan was built on fantasy. Japan's entire strategy depended on something it didn't have: time and oil. Its economy ran almost entirely on imported fuel, and its industrial base was fragile. Every ship sunk, every tank built, every plane that took off burned through resources Japan couldn't easily replace. Meanwhile, American industry was shifting into overdrive. Ford, Boeing, and General Motors, companies that once made cars and appliances, were now turning out planes, tanks, and engines by the thousands. Factories that had sat idle in 1941 were now running 3 shifts a day. In January 1942, Japan's intelligence reports estimated that America would produce roughly 19,000 military aircraft that year. Japan's factories? Barely 5,000. By the next year, those same estimates predicted the United States would build 85,000. Japan might produce 16,000 if everything went perfectly, and nothing in war ever goes perfectly. Inside the Japanese Navy, these numbers weren't just statistics. They were death sentences written in ink. The admirals understood what exponential growth meant. They could see the graph lines diverging, one soaring upward, the other flatlining. But those in political power refused to listen. Tokyo's leaders were drunk on victory. They believed the Americans were soft, too dependent on comfort, too fearful of sacrifice. They believed democracy made them weak. Yamamoto knew better. He'd lived in the United States. He'd studied at Harvard. He had seen the size of America's factories, the energy of its workers, the discipline of its industry. He had warned Japan's cabinet again and again that once America mobilized, the war would become a machine that never stopped. And now, 8 months later, that machine was roaring to life. The first wave of U.S. carriers, the new Essex class, were already under construction. Massive, modern, and capable of launching more aircraft than anything in Japan's fleet. American shipyards were turning out destroyers faster than Japan could sink them. Airfields were rising across the Pacific, from Hawaii to Midway to Guadalcanal. Every single day that passed tilted the balance further out of Japan's reach. By the summer of 1942, even Japan's most loyal officers could see it. They weren't fighting the same war anymore. The Empire's window of opportunity, that critical 8-month gap where victory had once seemed possible, had closed forever. And when that window shut, it didn't just trap Japan inside a losing war, it sealed its fate. Because the next major battle, the one meant to crush American morale and restore Japan's dominance, would do the exact opposite. It would expose the Empire's weakness for the entire world to see. That battle was Midway. June 4, 1942. The morning sky over the Pacific was clear, calm, almost deceptively peaceful. 4 Japanese aircraft carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, steamed toward a tiny speck of coral known as Midway Atoll. They carried Japan's finest pilots, the most experienced aviators in the world, and the hopes of an entire empire. The plan was elegant on paper, complex, calculated, and confident. Midway would be bait. America would rush to defend it, sailing its few remaining carriers straight into a trap. Japan would crush them in one decisive blow and erase Pearl Harbor's survivors from history. But unknown to the admirals aboard those carriers, the trap had already been reversed. American cryptographers, a small, quiet group of codebreakers working in a nondescript building in Hawaii, had cracked Japan's naval communications. They knew where the attack would happen, when it would happen, and even the formation of the enemy fleet. When the first Japanese planes launched their attack on Midway, American forces were already waiting for them. At 10:22 a.m., in just 5 devastating minutes, the course of the entire Pacific War changed forever. Dive bombers from the USS Enterprise and Yorktown broke through Japan's defenses. One after another, their bombs struck the flight decks of Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu. The explosions were catastrophic: aviation fuel igniting, ammunition detonating, aircraft bursting into flames before they could even take off. Within minutes, 3 of Japan's elite carriers, ships that had led the attack on Pearl Harbor, were burning wrecks. Hundreds of Japan's best pilots and crewmen were trapped inside, their years of experience vanishing in smoke and fire. By the end of the day, Hiryu, the last surviving carrier, was also found and destroyed. 4 carriers gone. Over 250 aircraft lost. Thousands of sailors dead. In a single day, Japan's greatest naval weapon, the same strike force that had terrified the Pacific, ceased to exist. To the Japanese High Command, the shock was incomprehensible. For months they had believed themselves untouchable. Their navy had swept through Asia without a single major defeat. Now, in the space of hours, that illusion had been obliterated. Admiral Yamamoto, still commanding from hundreds of miles away aboard his flagship Yamato, received the reports in silence. He knew immediately what it meant. He didn't rage. He didn't curse. He simply said, "So, it has come." Because for Yamamoto, this was not just a military defeat, it was confirmation of his greatest fear. The war had just entered a phase Japan could never win. The loss of 4 carriers wasn't just a tactical blow, it was a strategic death sentence. Those ships weren't just steel and engines. They were floating universities, training centers for Japan's irreplaceable carrier pilots. Each destroyed carrier meant the loss of hundreds of elite airmen who had spent years perfecting their craft. There was no system, no factory, no training pipeline that could replace them fast enough. Japan had entered the war with 10 fleet carriers. By August 1942, only 6 remained, and 2 of those were damaged. Meanwhile, the United States was building replacements faster than Japan could count them. The new Essex-class carriers, larger, faster, deadlier, were already under construction. In shipyards across the American coast, welders worked day and night, turning blueprints into steel giants. Each one a symbol of an industrial power that had just begun to awaken. Inside Japan's naval command rooms, the tone changed overnight. Optimism vanished. Reports turned grim. Analysts stopped talking about victory and started talking about survival. At the time, Japan's leaders tried to downplay the loss. They told the public it had been a draw, that American forces had suffered equal damage. But inside the Navy, the truth spread like a shadow. Everyone who read the after-action reports understood the reality. Japan had gambled everything at Midway, and lost. From that point forward, Japan's war was no longer about expansion. It was about endurance. Midway didn't just sink ships, it sank the illusion that Japan could win through speed, surprise, or daring. And as the smoke cleared over the Pacific, one brutal truth became clear to every admiral who studied the numbers. The empire that had once ruled the seas was now outnumbered, outbuilt, and soon, out of time. But the losses at Midway were only the beginning. Because what came next would be even worse, the slow, suffocating realization that Japan wasn't just losing ships. It was losing the one thing it couldn't replace, its pilots. After Midway, Japan's admirals didn't need to see the battle reports to know what was coming. The numbers told the story on their own, cold, relentless, impossible to argue with. In the summer of 1942, Japan still held a vast empire. It still had experienced pilots, functioning carriers, and a navy that could fight. But beneath that surface, the foundations were already cracking. Because for every ship Japan lost, America was building 3. For every pilot that didn't return, America trained a dozen more. What Japan didn't realize yet was that the Pacific War had shifted from a fight of tactics to a fight of factories. And factories don't bleed, they don't tire, and they don't surrender. In 1941, American industry was just waking up. By 1942, it was in full roar. Factories in California and Michigan, once producing cars and refrigerators, were now turning out planes and tanks on an industrial scale. Boeing's Seattle assembly lines produced new bombers every hour. Ford's Willow Run plant, known as the Arsenal of Democracy, was spitting out B-24 bombers faster than Japan could even refuel its own. Japan's pilots called it the American miracle, but to them, it was a nightmare they couldn't wake from. By the end of 1942, American shipyards had more than a dozen fleet carriers under construction, all Essex class, all larger and more capable than anything Japan had ever built. By the next year, they would start rolling off the docks one after another like clockwork. By 1944, the United States Navy wouldn't just match Japan, it would dwarf it. And the same story was repeating in the skies. In 1941, Japanese factories had built just under 5,000 aircraft, an impressive number for an island nation with limited resources. That same year, America built nearly 19,000. By 1943, U.S. production skyrocketed to 85,000 aircraft. Japan could barely manage 16,000. Every Japanese intelligence officer who saw those numbers understood what they meant. The war was mathematically unwinnable. No amount of courage or sacrifice could bridge a gap like that. Captain Mitsuo Fukuda, the man who had led the air strike on Pearl Harbor, returned from his injuries at Midway to brief the naval staff that August. His report was devastating. He explained that Japan's naval aviation force had begun the war with roughly 3,500 elite carrier pilots, men who had trained for years, who had spent hundreds of hours perfecting every landing, every torpedo run. By August 1942, nearly 40% of them were gone. Killed at Coral Sea, lost at Midway, or ground down in the brutal skies above the Solomon Islands. The few survivors were exhausted, flying multiple missions a day, sleeping in cockpits, eating what little they could. They were still the best in the world, but they were running on fumes. Meanwhile, American pilot schools were training replacements by the thousands. At first, their pilots were inexperienced, clumsy, and poorly coordinated. But it didn't matter. The numbers were overwhelming. Every mistake was just another lesson learned. Every loss, immediately replaced. Fukuda's calculations chilled the room. At the current rate of losses, Japan would run out of experienced carrier pilots by the middle of 1943. It wouldn't matter how many carriers they had left, without trained aviators, they were floating targets. He described it simply, almost poetically. Every man we lose takes 10 years of experience with him. And we have no more years to give. The admirals listened in silence. They didn't interrupt. There was nothing to say. They all knew what that meant. Japan was fighting a war of attrition, and it was losing it at every level. The empire's best pilots were dying faster than they could be replaced. Its shipyards couldn't keep up. Its factories couldn't match the endless rhythm of American steel and fire. And the longer the war dragged on, the faster that gap would widen. Because while Japan was running out of men, machines, and materials, America was only getting stronger. The same nation Japan had hoped to frighten into submission was now producing so much war material that it couldn't even store it all. Entire convoys of ships left port every week, filled with planes so new the paint was still drying. And for Japan's navy, there was an even crueler twist. Those ships, those aircraft, those tanks, they weren't being built for profit. They were being built for revenge. The sleeping giant wasn't just awake. It was angry. But Japan's troubles didn't end with factories and pilots. Because even as their production fell behind, another enemy had begun quietly choking the empire to death, one torpedo at a time. And this enemy didn't come from the sky. It came from below. By late 1942, Japan's enemies weren't just the fleets they could see, they were the ones they couldn't. Beneath the endless blue of the Pacific, American submarines began a quiet, deadly campaign that would do what no bomb could: starve an empire. Japan's military machine ran on oil. Its planes, ships, tanks, and trucks all depended on a steady flow of crude from the Dutch East Indies, modern-day Indonesia, a region captured early in the war with the single goal of securing fuel. Those oil fields were supposed to guarantee Japan's survival. But there was one problem Yamamoto hadn't solved: getting the oil home. Tankers had to cross thousands of miles of open ocean, through narrow choke points and treacherous waters increasingly infested with American submarines. At first, the attacks seemed random, a few ships sunk here and there. The Japanese Navy dismissed them as bad luck. But by the summer of 1942, it became impossible to ignore. Every week, more tankers vanished. Merchant captains reported torpedoes streaking out of nowhere, explosions that split ships in half, men thrown into oil-slicked water as flames spread across the sea. American submarines were relentless. They didn't need massive fleets or grand battles, they just needed patience. One well-placed strike on a tanker could cripple an entire supply chain. And while Japan's submarines were sleek and technically advanced, they were tragically misused. Instead of targeting merchant shipping, the lifeblood of an enemy economy, they were assigned to hunt warships, an enemy that rarely appeared. The result was predictable. American convoys kept moving. Japanese ones didn't. By January 1942, Japan was losing 15 merchant ships a month. By June, it was 30. By August, 40 ships, every single month, disappearing beneath the waves. The graphs presented in Japan's naval intelligence offices looked like falling staircases: tonnage down, losses up, and no sign of recovery. Admiral Yamaguchi reviewed the latest numbers with grim calm. Japan's shipyards could build about 200,000 tons of merchant shipping per year, but they were losing nearly 300,000. And that gap wasn't shrinking. It was widening. The reports became more horrifying each month. In January 1942, Japan imported roughly 400,000 tons of oil from the Indies. By August, only 250,000. At that rate, analysts warned, by mid-1943 Japan wouldn't have enough fuel to sustain full-scale operations. The empire had secured the oil fields, but now had no way to bring the oil home. It was like watching a man suffocate with a tank of oxygen just out of reach. Inside the fleet, the effects were immediate. Pilots were told to cut back on flight hours to conserve fuel. Training exercises were cancelled. Warships spent more time anchored than at sea. Every gallon of oil was rationed, every voyage carefully calculated. Even simple patrols were considered luxuries. And yet, the Americans seemed to have no such limits. Their fleets were growing. Their planes flew constantly. Their carriers roamed the Pacific at will. To the Japanese crews, it felt like fighting a ghost that never ran out of strength. One admiral reportedly muttered during a meeting, "We have the land, but they have the ocean." He was right. America controlled the sea lanes, and that meant they controlled Japan's future. By late 1942, the submarine war had become the empire's silent disaster, rarely mentioned in public, almost never discussed in official briefings, but quietly recognized by every strategist who saw the numbers. Japan could build new planes, new ships, even new airfields, but none of it mattered if the engines stayed cold and the fuel tanks stayed dry. The empire wasn't being bombed into submission. It was being strangled. Slowly. Invisibly. Irreversibly. And just as Japan's supply lines began to collapse, another threat was rising, one far more immediate, and far more humiliating. Because the Americans weren't just cutting Japan off from the world. They were coming straight for its doorstep. And the first blow would land on a tiny, forgotten island called Guadalcanal. By late 1942, Japan's empire stretched across half the Pacific. From the jungles of Burma to the coral atolls of the Marshall Islands, the rising sun flag waved over more territory than any Asian power had ever controlled. On paper, it was a triumph, an empire that seemed untouchable, a chain of islands and fortresses that could hold back the West for decades. But inside Japan's naval headquarters, the maps told a different story. Those same red lines that marked victory were now beginning to look like a noose. Japan's rapid expansion had created a defensive perimeter thousands of miles wide, an oceanic fortress so vast that it could never be fully protected. Every captured island needed garrisons. Every garrison needed food, ammunition, oil, and reinforcements. And every one of those things had to cross an ocean now crawling with American submarines. To the public, it looked like Japan had built a shield around its empire. To the admirals, it looked like they had built a trap around themselves. The empire's outer defenses, places like Rabaul, Truk, and Guadalcanal, were supposed to keep America out. Instead, they became isolated outposts, cut off from supply and slowly starved. The Americans, meanwhile, had learned something crucial. They didn't need to fight everywhere. They could choose their battles. Japan had to defend everything. America only had to attack somewhere. It was the perfect asymmetry. One side could dictate the pace of war, the other could only react. By the summer of 1942, that strategy had a name: island hopping. Instead of smashing head-on into Japan's strongest defenses, American forces began seizing strategic islands, small, overlooked positions that could host airfields and ports. Once taken, these bases became stepping stones, allowing American bombers and carriers to leapfrog closer to Japan itself. The first of these was Guadalcanal. In August 1942, U.S. Marines landed on a tiny, swampy island in the Solomon Chain, an island most Japanese officers couldn't have found on a map 6 months earlier. But that single landing changed everything. For the first time, the United States wasn't defending, it was advancing. Guadalcanal wasn't just another battle. It was a statement: America was coming. Japanese commanders threw everything they had into retaking the island: aircraft, warships, and thousands of soldiers. The result was brutal: months of non-stop fighting in rain-soaked jungles, where disease and hunger claimed as many lives as bullets. At night, the sea around Guadalcanal glowed with burning ships, the aftermath of desperate naval battles fought at point-blank range. Japanese sailors called it the iron-bottom sound. Every ship sunk there became part of the seabed, a monument to Japan's growing desperation. And while Japan fought for every inch, America was already building. On the same island, within days of landing, U.S. engineers had seized a half-finished Japanese airfield and turned it into a fortress, Henderson Field. From there, American planes dominated the skies, cutting off reinforcements and supplies. It was a new kind of warfare, slow, methodical, and devastatingly efficient. Japan's forces were still fierce, still disciplined, but they were trapped in a cycle they couldn't escape. Every victory cost resources they couldn't replace. Every defeat cost lives they couldn't afford to lose. Back in Tokyo, reports from the front grew worse by the week. Commanders requested more ships, more fuel, more planes, but there was nothing left to give. The admirals knew the pattern. They'd seen it before. When an empire grows faster than it can supply itself, collapse isn't a question of if, it's a question of when. Admiral Yamaguchi summed it up bitterly during one meeting. We took everything, and in doing so, we left ourselves nothing. The Americans could concentrate their strength wherever they wished, and Japan, bound by pride and policy, had to defend every inch of its empire, no matter the cost. That imbalance, that cruel math, would define the rest of the war. Because while Japan was burning fuel just to stand still, America was gathering momentum. And that momentum would soon carry them past the outer ring of islands, across the Pacific, and straight toward Japan itself. But before that final reckoning came, the Japanese High Command had to face another kind of defeat, not on the battlefield, but in their own hearts. They had misjudged something even more powerful than industrial strength or military numbers. They had misjudged America itself. For all of Japan's brilliant tactics, its daring strategies, and its early victories, one truth stood above all others: the empire didn't lose the war on the battlefield. It lost it in its assumptions. From the very beginning, Japan's leaders had built their war plan on a single idea: that America didn't have the will to fight a long, costly war. They believed the U.S. was soft, divided, spoiled by comfort and prosperity. They saw a democracy that argued too much, a people too accustomed to peace to endure hardship. If Japan could strike fast, deal one massive blow, and humiliate America, surely the politicians in Washington would panic. Surely the public would demand peace. That was the theory. But it was wrong. Catastrophically wrong. When the bombs fell on Pearl Harbor, Japan expected fear. What it got was fury. The next morning, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before Congress and declared December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Within hours, the United States declared war, not reluctantly, not hesitantly, but with absolute unity. For the first time in modern history, every American, farmer, factory worker, and soldier, wanted the same thing: revenge. And that single emotion, more than any weapon, reshaped the entire war. Japan's leaders couldn't comprehend it. They believed morale was fragile, that democracies were weak because they argued in public. But America's arguments vanished overnight. Political divisions dissolved. Factories that once competed for customers now worked together for production quotas. Even Hollywood turned from entertainment to propaganda, turning every film, every song, every radio broadcast into a weapon of motivation. The Japanese High Command had awakened something they didn't understand, a nation that didn't just fight for territory, but for justice. American newspapers didn't print the words defeat or fear. They printed vengeance, resolve, and honor. Families hung flags in their windows for sons who enlisted. Children collected scrap metal for bombs. Women flooded the factories, building the planes and ships that would soon erase Japan's empire from the map. The empire's leaders had gambled that Americans wouldn't tolerate high casualties. But after Pearl Harbor, that logic no longer applied. America wasn't calculating losses, it was calculating payback. Every ship sunk at Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry. Every casualty was another reason to fight harder. Meanwhile, Japan's own population was told only of victories. Newspapers spoke of glory, not of the dead. The people were fed illusion, while the military drowned in reality. And as Japan underestimated America's anger, it also underestimated America's adaptability. When Japan's Zero fighters dominated early air battles, American engineers studied them, dismantled captured wrecks, and within months began producing planes that outperformed them. When Japanese torpedoes struck with precision, American industry built stronger hulls, better armor, faster ships. Every blow Japan landed only made its enemy smarter. And perhaps most fatally, Pearl Harbor gave the United States something Japan could never reclaim: the moral high ground. To the rest of the world, Japan's attack wasn't seen as bold or heroic. It was seen as treachery. The empire's diplomats were supposed to deliver a declaration of war before the attack began, but delays in decoding and communication meant the message arrived after the bombs fell. The result was devastating. To the world, Pearl Harbor was a sneak attack, a crime against honor and international law. America seized on that moment instantly. Remember Pearl Harbor wasn't just a slogan, it was a moral shield. It turned every battle into justice, every victory into redemption. And for Japan, that perception became a trap they could never escape. No peace offer, no diplomatic maneuver, no surrender could erase the memory of that morning, the smoke, the fire, the ships burning in the harbor. Yamamoto had warned his government what would happen. He said he could run wild, for 6 months, maybe a year, but after that, America's power would become unstoppable. He was right. By 1943, American production had turned the Pacific into a factory for destruction. Bombers filled the skies, fleets filled the seas, and every island Japan held was now a target waiting its turn. Japan had won the first move. But America had taken the board. And while Japanese admirals still spoke of honor and destiny, they knew, deep down, that the war they thought they understood was gone. The empire hadn't just underestimated America's weapons. It had underestimated America's spirit. And that mistake, that single miscalculation, would prove even deadlier than any bomb. But if Pearl Harbor gave America its fury, the next events would give Japan its despair. Because soon, a daring raid would strike at the very heart of Tokyo, and forced Japan's high command into one of the worst decisions of the entire war. Spring 1942. Tokyo was quiet, confident. The empire stretched from India's doorstep to the Pacific horizon. The news from the front was glorious. The Japanese people believed victory was destiny. But then, out of nowhere, came the sound that no one in Japan had ever expected to hear, the distant growl of engines. On April 18, 16 American B-25 bombers appeared over the capital. They came from nowhere. They came from the sea. And for the first time in history, the skies above Tokyo thundered with enemy aircraft. The attack was small, almost symbolic. The bombers dropped only a handful of explosives. A few fires, a few casualties. Militarily, it was meaningless. But psychologically? It was shattering. The Japanese public had been told the homeland was untouchable, that no foreign enemy could ever reach their sacred islands. And yet there it was, proof that America could strike Japan itself. The raid was the brainchild of Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a name few in Japan knew, but one they would never forget. His mission was audacious: launch medium bombers from an aircraft carrier, something no one had ever attempted, hit the Japanese capital, and then escape to China. It shouldn't have worked. But it did. The sight of American bombers over Tokyo was more than an attack, it was humiliation. It tore apart the illusion of Japanese invincibility. It told every citizen, every general, every politician that the war they thought they were controlling was slipping from their hands. The damage to Tokyo's buildings was minor. But the damage to Japan's confidence was catastrophic. Admiral Yamamoto was furious, not because of the destruction, but because of what it meant. The Americans had used carriers to strike the Japanese homeland. That meant the U.S. Navy, the same fleet Japan believed it had destroyed at Pearl Harbor, was still alive, still hunting. In response, Japan's high command made a decision born of pride, not strategy. They would destroy America's carriers once and for all, lure them into a trap so perfect that no one would survive. That plan became Operation Mi. The target, a small, isolated atoll halfway between Hawaii and Japan, Midway. Yamamoto designed the operation with mathematical precision. Multiple fleets would converge from different directions, feint attacks would draw U.S. forces away, and once the Americans took the bait, Japan's main carrier strike force would annihilate them. It was ambitious. It was complex. It was exactly the kind of plan that only worked when every detail stayed secret. And that was the problem. Japan didn't know that, by this point, its codes were broken. American intelligence officers at Pearl Harbor, led by cryptanalyst Joseph Rockefort, had been reading Japan's naval communications for months. They knew the plan, the timing, even the fleet composition. When the first Japanese planes launched their attack on Midway, America was already waiting. The irony is almost poetic. The Doolittle raid, a mission that caused almost no military damage, triggered Japan's most disastrous operation. It pushed a proud empire into a battle it didn't need to fight, and couldn't afford to lose. And when that battle came, it destroyed 4 of Japan's carriers and the irreplaceable airmen who flew from them. That's the cruel symmetry of war. The attack that was meant to restore honor led to humiliation. The operation meant to ensure victory guaranteed defeat. But the Doolittle raid's effects went beyond military consequences. It hardened Japan's government, silenced moderates, and convinced the army that the home islands needed defending, draining precious aircraft and troops from other fronts. The empire had been reacting ever since Pearl Harbor, chasing ghosts, striking at shadows, always one step behind a growing storm. Now that storm was about to become a hurricane. Because Japan's defeats weren't only on the battlefield or in the sea lanes. They were buried in the ledgers of its factories, its banks, and its fuel reserves, numbers that told a story far darker than any battle report. The admirals in Truk Lagoon would soon see that for themselves. Because when they opened the finance ministry's latest analysis, it didn't predict victory, or even stalemate. It predicted collapse. War, at its core, is a contest of endurance. And by the end of 1942, Japan's endurance was collapsing, not from bombs or battles, but from arithmetic. Inside the Admiralty's war room, the walls were lined with maps, charts, and tables filled with numbers. Every line told the same story. Japan's resources, oil, steel, rubber, food, were bleeding away faster than they could be replaced. The empire had conquered the largest landmass it had ever dreamed of. It controlled mines, plantations, and ports across Southeast Asia. On paper, it looked like infinite wealth. But every one of those resources had to be shipped across an ocean, and that ocean now belonged to America. Japan's industrial machine had always been smaller, but now it was starving. By the summer of 1942, American shipyards were launching new vessels faster than Japan could sink them. Factories in Detroit and Seattle were running around the clock, powered by endless coal, oil, and manpower. Meanwhile, Japan's factories were going dark. Air raids, shortages, and logistical nightmares turned once proud production centers into ghost buildings. A single American city, Detroit, was producing more military hardware than all of Japan combined. In July, the Finance Ministry released a report so bleak that few dared to read it aloud. It projected Japan's economic capacity under several war scenarios. Even in the most optimistic, assuming no major defeats, no loss of territory, and uninterrupted oil shipments, the empire's economy would still collapse by late 1944. That was the best case. The report estimated that, at the current rate of loss, Japan's merchant fleet would be reduced by half within 18 months. Without ships, there would be no supplies. Without supplies, no fuel. And without fuel, no war. One line in the report chilled every officer who read it. The nation will possess oil, but no means to transport it. It was the cruelest irony imaginable. Japan had fought the United States to secure oil, and now, surrounded by oil fields, it couldn't move a single drop home. Tankers burned on the ocean surface, their black smoke rising like funeral pyres. Pilots rationed flight hours. Warships sat anchored in harbors, their engines cold. The empire's war machine was literally running out of gas. Even worse, inflation was spiraling out of control. Prices doubled, then tripled. Civilians were told to tighten their belts for the emperor. But no amount of loyalty could feed empty stomachs. Rice, sugar, and meat disappeared from markets. Cities grew quiet, dim, and hungry. And through it all, the Americans only grew stronger. Their production didn't just outmatch Japan's, it dwarfed it. By 1943, U.S. shipyards were launching one new vessel every single day. Steel mills in Pittsburgh were pouring enough metal to build an entire fleet each month. The empire was fighting an opponent that could lose a battle, rebuild, and come back stronger, while Japan could not afford a single mistake. To the admirals reviewing these numbers, the conclusion was obvious. Japan could not win. Not militarily. Not economically. Not mathematically. And yet, they also knew the government would never accept this truth. Pride had replaced logic. Honor had replaced strategy. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi studied the report in silence. When he finally spoke, his words were heavy, almost whispered. Our strength is a candle in the wind. Bright for a moment, then gone forever. No one responded. There was nothing to say. Japan's leaders had gambled their nation's future on a war they couldn't afford to lose, but also couldn't afford to fight. Every battle was now fought on borrowed time, borrowed oil, borrowed lives. And the cruelest part was this: the admirals had seen it coming. They had warned their government, their army, their emperor. But no one wanted to hear it. The war that had begun with fire and glory had turned into a slow, unstoppable decline, a collapse not of courage, but of capacity. Still, for these men, there was one final humiliation waiting. Because even after accepting that victory was impossible, they realized there was no way out. They couldn't speak the truth. They couldn't suggest peace. To do so would mean disgrace, or death. The only thing left was silence. And duty. But inside that silence, one question lingered, haunting them all. If Japan had lost the war so early, when exactly had the defeat truly begun? The answer, they realized, was the most painful truth of all. It hadn't begun at Midway. It hadn't begun with submarines or shortages. It had begun the moment the first bomb fell on Pearl Harbor. August 6, 1942. In the dim conference room aboard the Shokaku, the admirals sat in silence. Before them lay the reports, losses, production charts, shipping graphs, pilot rosters, pages of cold, merciless truth. Each number, each line of ink, was a sentence in Japan's obituary. For hours they had argued over tactics, logistics, reinforcements. But deep down, they all knew it didn't matter. The math didn't lie. The war was lost. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi broke the silence first, his voice low and calm. "If we continue like this," he said, "there will be nothing left of the Navy by next year." No one disagreed. The air was thick with cigarette smoke, and even thicker with denial. These were men who had dedicated their entire lives to Japan's Navy, men who had commanded fleets, conquered nations, and watched the empire of the rising sun expand farther than anyone thought possible. Now they were forced to face the unthinkable, that everything they'd built was collapsing, and there was nothing they could do to stop it. Some spoke of negotiating peace. Perhaps, one suggested, Japan could return some conquered territories and convince America to accept a ceasefire. The room fell silent. Then someone laughed, not out of humor, but disbelief. They all knew what America's answer would be. The attack on Pearl Harbor had burned too deep. It hadn't just sunk ships, it had ignited rage. America didn't want peace. It wanted justice. It wanted revenge. Every admiral in that room had read the intelligence reports. They knew the truth that Tokyo refused to say aloud: the American public would accept nothing short of unconditional surrender. And surrender was a word that didn't exist in Japan's military vocabulary. The officers knew that even suggesting peace could mean execution for defeatism. The government had made it clear: victory or death. There was no middle ground. So they stayed silent. They lit another cigarette. They stared at the maps. They talked about strategies they no longer believed in. Outside, the Pacific stretched endless and calm. The hum of the ship's engines was steady, mechanical, detached, indifferent to human despair. Yamaguchi finally closed his folder. "Then we fight," he said simply. "We fight because that is all we are allowed to do." The others nodded. Not in agreement, but in resignation. They would keep commanding ships, sending pilots to their deaths, defending islands they knew they couldn't hold. They would continue to plan operations that made no sense, issue orders that could change nothing, and watch their empire die one battle at a time. Because that was the only thing left: duty. To live without victory was shame. To admit defeat was treason. So they fought on, not for hope, but for honor. Each man in that room knew he would likely die before the war ended, and that when it did end, it would not be in triumph. In private, some whispered what no one dared say publicly: that Japan had lost the war on the very day it began. The attack on Pearl Harbor had been a tactical masterpiece, and a strategic disaster. It had given Japan everything it wanted, except a future. As the meeting ended, the officers filed out one by one. No speeches, no salutes, no farewells. Just quiet footsteps fading down the steel corridor. Above them, the sky was brilliant and blue, the lagoon still as glass. To anyone watching, it looked like peace. But below deck, the Empire's fate had already been sealed, not by battle, not by surrender, but by acknowledgement. They had awakened the sleeping giant. And now, all they could do was wait for it to arrive. August 6, 1942. The sun dipped low over Truk Lagoon, turning the water gold. The Shokaku sat anchored and still, its flight deck empty, its hangars quiet. The war had been raging for only 8 months, but for the men aboard, it already felt like a lifetime. Inside, the conference room was empty now, the maps folded away, the reports stacked neatly on the table, the air still faintly thick with cigarette smoke. What had been said in that room would never appear in any official record. There were no witnesses. No minutes. No orders issued. Only the truth, and the silence that followed it. The admirals returned to their duties, their faces expressionless, their eyes tired. They would continue to fight, to command, to obey. Outwardly, nothing had changed. But inside, everything had. Because from that day on, every operation, every battle, every order they gave carried the same unspoken knowledge: the war was already lost. It would take 3 more years, millions more lives, and unimaginable destruction for the world to see what those 5 men had seen that day. Cities would burn. Fleets would vanish. Entire islands would become graveyards. But the ending had already been written, here, in this quiet moment, on this forgotten day in 1942. That's the cruel thing about history. The moment of defeat doesn't always arrive with a bang. Sometimes it comes with a whisper. A simple sentence spoken softly in a room no one remembers. The war is lost. Asterisk. Pearl Harbor had been Japan's proudest moment, the strike that was supposed to secure its future. Instead, it had guaranteed its destruction. It had awakened a nation far more powerful than Japan had ever imagined, a nation that would not stop until the empire was ash and memory. In the end, Japan didn't fall because of courage or cowardice, strategy or chance. It fell because it tried to fight time itself, and time was on America's side. The empire that rose with the dawn had set before noon. And as the Pacific's waves lapped softly against the steel hull of the Shokaku, the admirals who once commanded an ocean understood something far greater than war. That some defeats begin the very moment victory seems certain. Japan hadn't lost the war in 1945. It had lost it the day it began, on December 7, 1941. The rest was just the waiting.